Have you ever felt caught in the grip of a compulsion you couldn't explain? A hunger that seemed to come from somewhere deeper than your body, more ancient than your thoughts? You reach for the substance, the behavior, the familiar escape, and in that moment of surrender, a strange paradox emerges. The very thing destroying you feels like the only thing keeping you alive. Carl Jung, the great explorer of the unconscious, saw something most people miss in addiction, something that might completely transform the way you understand your own struggle. He believed that addiction is not primarily a disease of weakness or moral failure, but rather a desperate, misdirected search for the divine, a spiritual thirst that has lost its way and seeks fulfillment in the wrong vessels. In Jung's profound vision, the addict is not broken beyond repair, but chosen for a particular kind of awakening, one that requires descent into darkness before the light can be truly seen. If you've ever wondered why some people seem unable to find satisfaction in ordinary life, why they chase extremes and court disaster, why they seem to be searching for something they cannot name, then what follows may illuminate not just addiction, but the hidden architecture of your own soul. Before we go deeper into this revelation, I want to invite you to join this community of seekers by subscribing to the channel and turning on notifications, because we explore these profound intersections of depth psychology, spirituality, and self-knowledge every week, offering you a progressive journey into the mysteries Jung dedicated his life to understanding. You'll find additional resources and references in the pinned comment and description below. Now back to this radical understanding of addiction as a spiritual crisis disguised as pathology. Jung once wrote to Bill Wilson, co-founder of Alcoholics Anonymous, that the craving for alcohol was actually the equivalent, on a low level, of the spiritual thirst of our being for wholeness, expressed in medieval language as the union with God. Think about that for a moment. The bottle, the needle, the compulsive behavior, all of these are corrupt symbols of a sacred longing, fallen versions of the soul's innate desire to transcend the prison of the isolated ego and merge with something greater, something infinite. This is why addiction carries such power, such overwhelming force. It is not merely a bad habit or a biochemical imbalance, though those elements are present. At its core, addiction is the soul crying out for ecstasy, for that state the mystics described as ecstasis, the standing outside of oneself, the temporary dissolution of the boundaries that separate the individual from the all. When you understand this, you begin to see addiction not as a random affliction, but as a meaningful, even sacred, though deeply dangerous communication from the unconscious. There is a particular type of person who becomes addicted. Not everyone who uses substances or engages in potentially compulsive behaviors falls into the abyss. Jung recognized that certain souls are marked by what he called a religious attitude, a fundamental inability to be satisfied with the surface of life, with conventional answers, with the consensus reality that satisfies most people. These individuals live with a persistent, often agonizing sense of incompleteness, a void that no amount of success, love, or achievement can fill. They are the ones who ask the dangerous questions, who cannot stop seeking, who feel exiled from a homeland they've never seen but somehow remember. When such a person does not find a conscious relationship with the sacred, when they have no viable spiritual path, no authentic connection to the self, Jung's term for the divine center within each person, then the unconscious begins to compensate. It creates a crisis, manufactures a catastrophe, initiates what looks like self-destruction, but is actually a brutal form of self-correction. Addiction becomes the vehicle through which the neglected soul finally gets the attention it has been desperately demanding. The substance or behavior offers a counterfeit transcendence, a chemical or behavioral simulation of what ought to be achieved through the hard work of individuation, Jung's term for the lifelong process of becoming whole. The high, the rush, the momentary obliteration of anxiety and self-consciousness, all of this mimics the mystical experience. For a brief window, the addict touches something that feels like freedom, like home, like the end of suffering. The tragedy is that this false transcendence cannot be sustained. It is a loan taken against the future, and the interest is devastating. Each episode of artificial elevation is followed by an equal or greater descent into darkness. The void grows larger. The soul's genuine need remains unmet. And so the cycle intensifies, the doses increase, the behavior becomes more extreme, because the person is chasing a memory of wholeness that the substance can only parody, never fulfill. This is why Jung insisted that the cure for addiction could not be found in willpower alone or in mere abstinence. The real healing required a spiritual transformation, a genuine encounter with the numinous, with that which is wholly other and yet intimately one's own deepest nature. He told Bill Wilson that the only thing that could match the power of spiritus, the Latin word for alcohol, but also for spirit, was an experience of spirit in its true form, capital S. In other words, only God can overcome the craving for God's counterfeit. But what does this mean practically? How does such a transformation occur? Jung's answer was both simple and terrifyingly demanding. Through the destruction of the ego's illusion of control. The addict must reach what is often called rock bottom, though this phrase barely captures the existential devastation involved. This is the point at which all strategies have failed, all masks have been stripped away, all familiar identities have collapsed. It is a kind of death, a descent into the underworld that mirrors the initiatory journeys described in mythology across cultures. The hero must die to who they were in order to be reborn as who they might become. In this place of utter defeat, something extraordinary can happen. When the ego finally admits its powerlessness, when it stops trying to manage the unmanageable and control the uncontrollable, it creates a space, a vacuum, into which a greater power can enter. 12-step programs call this a higher power. Jung would call it the self. The mystics would call it God. The name matters less than the experience, the overwhelming encounter with a presence that is unmistakably real, unmistakably other, and yet unmistakably connected to one's own deepest being. This is grace, not in a sentimental sense, but as a shattering, reorganizing force that enters life precisely when the person has run out of their own resources. Many who have experienced such moments report that they felt held, guided, or saved by something they cannot rationally explain. Jung would suggest that this something is the self breaking through the rubble of the collapsed ego, asserting its priority, reclaiming its rightful place as the center of the personality. From this perspective, the entire terrible journey of addiction has been, in a hidden sense, the self-strategy for awakening the person to a reality larger than their conscious mind can grasp. Think of it this way. The self speaks first in whispers, through dreams, through synchronicities, through subtle feelings of meaninglessness or restlessness. If these are ignored, the voice grows louder. It may speak through depression, through anxiety, through relationship failures, and if the person still does not listen, if they remain trapped in the ego's agenda of control and self-sufficiency, then the self may resort to more drastic measures. It creates a crisis so severe that the person has no choice but to pay attention. Addiction can be one such crisis, a controlled demolition of the personality designed to break the ego's stranglehold and force an encounter with the sacred. This is why Jung referred to certain addicts as the chosen ones. Not chosen for privilege or ease, but chosen for a particular kind of suffering that serves as a gateway to wisdom. They are the ones whose pain becomes a teacher, whose brokenness becomes a doorway. Their descent is not random, it is purposeful, though its purpose may only become clear in retrospect. They are living out, in their own flesh, a universal spiritual drama. The soul's need to break free from the prison of the ego and remember its divine origin. This understanding removes the shame and judgment that so often surround addiction. It does not excuse harmful behavior or minimize the real damage that addiction causes to individuals and their loved ones. But it does shift the lens through which we view the addict. Instead of seeing only weakness or moral failure, we begin to see a soul in the grip of a spiritual crisis, a person whose sickness is also, paradoxically, a kind of health, because it signals that they are not content with a shallow, inauthentic existence. Their addiction is evidence that somewhere deep within them, there is a refusal to settle for less than the real thing, the genuine encounter with meaning and transcendence. Jung believed that what is not brought into consciousness appears in our lives as fate. The addict's compulsion, then, is unconscious destiny demanding to become conscious purpose. The same fierce energy that drives the addiction, the same relentless seeking, the same willingness to risk everything, can be transformed into the fuel for spiritual growth. The person who has stared into the abyss and returned carries knowledge that cannot be learned from books or acquired second-hand. They have touched dimensions of reality, both light and dark, that remain theoretical for most people. This experiential knowledge becomes their authority, their gift, and potentially their service to others. In the process of recovery, if it is to be genuine and lasting, the addict must undergo what Jung called individuation. This is not simply sobriety, though abstinence may be a necessary foundation. Individuation is the much larger project of integrating the shadow, those parts of oneself that have been rejected, denied, or projected onto others. For the addict, the shadow often includes the compulsion itself, which is not evil, but rather a misdirected life force. The work is to recognize the compulsion as a carrier of energy that belongs to the self, energy that has been trapped in destructive patterns because it had no conscious, creative outlet. As this energy is reclaimed and redirected, the person begins to change at a fundamental level. What was once used to escape reality becomes the impetus to engage reality more deeply. The sensitivity that made ordinary life unbearable becomes a gift, a capacity for empathy and insight. The addict who has done this inner work often becomes a healer, because they can recognize in others the same cry for help that once echoed through their own being. This is what Jung meant by the wounded healer, the archetype of the person whose own suffering qualifies them to guide others through similar darkness. There is a beautiful and terrible paradox here. The wound and the gift are one. The very thing that seemed like curse becomes blessing. The addiction that brought devastation also brings, if met with courage and consciousness, an initiation into deeper life. The person discovers that they were not broken randomly, but that their breaking served a purpose, was part of a larger pattern, a sacred drama playing out through their particular life. God, or the self, or however you name that ultimate reality, was hidden in the addiction, calling through the compulsion, speaking through the chaos. Every relapse, every failure, every moment of despair was also, from this wider view, a lesson, a redirection, a persistent invitation to wake up and see the truth that conventional consciousness obscures. This does not mean that the suffering was good or that it should be romanticized. It was real, it was painful, and it caused real harm. But it also carried meaning, and that meaning can be retrieved, honored, and integrated. The alchemists, whose symbolism Jung studied extensively, spoke of turning lead into gold. This is not a literal chemical process, but a psychological and spiritual one. The lead is the raw base material of our compulsions, our unconscious drives, our suffering. The gold is the consciousness, the wisdom, the compassion that can be extracted from that suffering through the work of inner transformation. Addiction is the lead. The awakened, individuated person who emerges from the struggle is the gold, But the transformation requires fire, the fire of suffering, of crisis, of ego death. There is no gentle path through this. The alchemists called it the nigredo, the blackening, the stage of decomposition and despair that must be endured before new life can emerge. The addict in the depths of their compulsion is in the nigredo, surrounded by darkness, feeling abandoned by hope and meaning. What they do not yet know is that this darkness is also a womb, a space of potential, the necessary chaos from which new order will arise. If they can endure, if they can surrender, if they can allow the process to unfold rather than continue trying to control it, then the nigredo gives way to the albedo, the whitening, the dawning of new consciousness, and eventually to the rubedo, the reddening, the full integration and vitality of the transformed self. This is the path of individuation as Jung mapped it. And addiction can be, for some, the beginning of this journey. It forces the question, who am I really, beneath all my defenses and identities? It strips away the false self, and if the person is willing to go all the way down and then do the hard work of coming back up, it reveals the true self. The self that is connected to something larger, something eternal, something that can rightly be called divine. You might ask, how do I know if my suffering has this kind of meaning? How do I distinguish between destructive addiction and sacred initiation? Jung would say that the difference lies in your relationship to the suffering. If you remain unconscious, if you simply repeat the pattern without reflection, without seeking to understand its deeper message, then you stay trapped in compulsion. But if you begin to ask questions, if you start to pay attention to your dreams, your synchronicities, your inner images, if you seek help not just for symptom relief but for genuine transformation, then you are beginning to engage the process consciously. You are starting to hear the call that has been shouting through your pain. This requires brutal honesty, the willingness to look at yourself without flinching, to acknowledge the shadow, to admit powerlessness, and paradoxically, to claim responsibility for your own healing. It means finding guides, whether therapists, spiritual teachers, recovery communities, or some combination of these, who understand that addiction is not just a problem to be solved, but a mystery to be lived through. It means committing to the long, often unglamorous work of showing up for yourself day after day, even when you don't feel inspired, even when the old patterns call seductively, even when progress seems impossible. Jung warned that individuation is not for everyone. It requires a certain courage, a willingness to face the unknown, to question everything you thought you knew about yourself. Most people prefer the security of the familiar, even if the familiar is painful. But for those who have been gripped by addiction, there may be no choice. The comfortable illusions have already been shattered. The question is whether they will use the ruins as building material for something new, or simply try to reconstruct the same flimsy structure that collapsed. If you are someone who has struggled with addiction, or if you love someone who has, consider this perspective. What if the addiction is not the enemy, but a fierce and desperate ally trying to wake you up? What if the craving, the compulsion, the relentless dissatisfaction are all signals from your deepest self that you are meant for something more than a conventional surface-level existence? What if your sensitivity, your inability to be satisfied with easy answers, your tendency toward extremes are not flaws but indications that you are called to a deeper journey? Jung believed that every psychological problem, when pursued to its depths, reveals a spiritual question. The question hidden in addiction might be, what is my relationship to the sacred? Have I found a genuine path to transcendence, or am I still seeking it in counterfeits? Am I willing to undergo the death and rebirth that true transformation requires? These are not abstract philosophical questions. They are intensely practical because how you answer them will determine the course of your life. If you recognize that your compulsion is a distorted form of spiritual hunger, then the solution is not just to remove the substance or behavior, though that may be necessary. The solution is to find authentic ways to feed your soul, to connect with the numinous, to experience the kind of transcendence you've been seeking all along. This might mean meditation, prayer, engagement with sacred texts, immersion in nature, creative work, depth psychotherapy, or participation in a community that values the inner life. It will almost certainly mean developing a relationship with your unconscious through attention to dreams and active imagination, practices Jung developed for this purpose. It means learning to listen to the self, not through the distorted channel of addiction, but through the clearer, though more demanding channels of conscious spiritual practice. The path is not easy, and there are no guarantees. Some people do not make it back from the abyss. Addiction is dangerous. It kills and it destroys lives. This is the terrible risk involved. But for those who do emerge, who do the work, who allow the poison to become medicine, the transformation is profound. They often speak of their gratitude for the experience, not because the suffering was pleasant, but because it brought them to a place they would never have reached otherwise. It broke them open. It destroyed their illusions. It forced them to find resources, both inner and outer, that they didn't know they had. It connected them to a power greater than themselves. It gave them a depth of compassion and understanding that cannot be faked or learned intellectually. In this sense, their addiction was indeed a wake-up call from God, a severe mercy, a dark blessing. Jung's message to those struggling with addiction is ultimately one of hope, but not cheap hope. Not the hope that says everything will be fine if you just try harder or think more positively. It is the hope that says your suffering is meaningful, that it can be transformed, that you are not a mistake or a failure, but a soul in the midst of a difficult and sacred process. It is the hope that says the same force that seems to be destroying you might actually be trying to save you, if you can learn to recognize it and cooperate with it. It is the hope that says wholeness is possible, not through bypassing the darkness, but through going all the way through it and discovering the light on the other side. This is the path of the chosen ones, those who cannot find peace in superficial solutions, who must go to the depths to find what they seek. If you are one of these, know that you are not alone. The journey you are on has been walked by countless others. The wisdom traditions, the depth psychologists, the recovered addicts who have gone before, all testify to the same truth. The wound is also the doorway. The place of your greatest pain is also the place of your potential transformation. What looks like curse can become calling. What feels like abandonment can become encounter. And the God you sought in the bottle, the pill, the screen, the compulsive behavior, that God has been waiting for you all along, not in the counterfeit, but in the authentic, not in the escape, but in the engagement, not in the dissolution of consciousness, but in its expansion and deepening. The spiritual thirst that drove your addiction is real and valid. It is the soul's natural orientation toward its source. The error was not in the longing, but in the object of the longing. Now the invitation is to redirect that powerful energy, that fierce seeking, toward what can actually satisfy it. This requires surrender, the kind of surrender that feels like death to the ego, but is actually birth for the self. It requires trust in a process you cannot control, faith in a wisdom deeper than your conscious mind. It requires community, because no one individuates alone. We need others to mirror us, to challenge us, to support us. And it requires patience, because transformation happens in its own time, according to rhythms that cannot be rushed. But if you commit to this path, if you allow your addiction to become your initiation, then you will discover something extraordinary. That you were never truly powerless. You were overpowered by a force that belongs to you, but is greater than your ego. When you stop fighting it and start working with it, when you give it conscious expression instead of letting it erupt destructively, it becomes your greatest ally. The energy that fueled your addiction becomes the energy that fuels your healing, your creativity, your service, your individuation. This is the alchemy Jung spoke of, the transformation of the personality through the integration of all that has been rejected and denied. The addict who becomes whole does not lose their intensity or their sensitivity. They learn to channel it. They do not become normal in the sense of conventional. They become more fully themselves, which often means more unusual, more creative, more capable of profound connection and insight. They carry the gold that was hidden in the lead of their suffering, and that gold is precious beyond measure. So if you stand today in the midst of the struggle, know this: your pain is not meaningless. Your compulsion is not evidence of weakness, but of a soul that refuses to settle for less than the real thing. The call you've been hearing, the hunger you've been trying to fill, these are sacred, even when they've led you into dark places. You are being invited, through the very severity of your crisis, to undertake the hero's journey, to descend into your own underworld and retrieve the treasure hidden there. That treasure is your authentic self, your connection to the divine, your capacity to live with depth and purpose and meaning. It has been waiting for you all along, hidden beneath layers of conditioning and fear and unconsciousness. And the addiction, terrible as it has been the explosive charge that breaks through those layers, that makes the descent possible, that initiates the transformation. The wake-up call has sounded. The question now is whether you will answer it, whether you will do the work, whether you will trust that the force moving through your life, even when it feels destructive, is ultimately in service of your wholeness. Jung believed it is, and countless others who have walked this path testify to the same truth. The wound is where the light enters. The breaking is where the breakthrough happens. The addiction is where God has been calling you all along, waiting for you to recognize the voice, to see through the disguise, to understand that what looked like abandonment was actually relentless pursuit, that you were never alone, that you were always held, that your suffering has been from the beginning a strange and terrible form of love, the love that will not let you remain asleep, the love that breaks you open so that you can finally, truly, deeply wake up. This awakening that Jung speaks of is not a one-time event, but an ongoing practice, a daily choice to remain conscious rather than slip back into the comfortable numbness that addiction offered. It means developing what Jung called symbolic life, a way of living that recognizes the deeper meanings hidden in everyday experiences, that sees the sacred not as something distant and abstract, but as something present and active in your actual circumstances. The person recovering from addiction learns to read their life symbolically, to ask not just what happened, but what does this mean? When a craving arises, instead of immediately acting on it or trying to suppress it, they pause and inquire, what is this craving really asking for? What need lies beneath the surface urge? Often they discover that the craving is not for the substance itself, but for connection, for peace, for a sense of being held by something larger than themselves. Once this underlying need is recognized, it can be addressed more directly and authentically. This practice of inquiry, of slowing down and listening to the unconscious, gradually builds a new relationship between ego and self, one based not on the ego's frantic attempts at control, but on humble cooperation with a wiser intelligence. Jung often spoke of the transcendent function, the psyche's natural capacity to bring together opposites and create something new from their tension. In addiction, you are torn between two extremes: the compulsion to use and the desire to be free, the experience of the high and the devastation of the crash, the part of you that wants to die and the part that desperately wants to live. These opposites seem irreconcilable, and the addict typically swings between them, caught in exhausting cycles of indulgence and abstinence, rebellion and submission. But the transcendent function offers a third way, not a compromise between the opposites, but a new position that includes and transforms both. This happens when you stop identifying exclusively with either pole and instead hold the tension between them consciously, allowing something unexpected to emerge. In practical terms, this might mean acknowledging both your vulnerability to addiction and your capacity for healing, both your need for support and your own inner strength, both the reality of your past failures and the possibility of future growth. You become larger than the conflict, capable of containing it without being destroyed by it. This is the beginning of genuine freedom, not the false freedom of doing whatever you want, which is actually slavery to impulse, but the real freedom of choosing consciously, of responding rather than reacting, of living from your center rather than being pushed around by unconscious forces. The transcendent function does not eliminate difficulty or remove all desire, but it gives you a place to stand, an inner stability that is not dependent on external circumstances or the presence or absence of craving. From this place, recovery becomes sustainable because it is rooted in something deeper than willpower or fear. Those who walk this path often report a growing sense of being accompanied, of not being alone in their struggle. Jung would say this is the self making itself known, offering guidance and support in ways that may be subtle or dramatic. Some people experience vivid dreams that provide insight or warning. Others notice synchronicities, meaningful coincidences that seem to confirm they are on the right track or redirect them when they are veering off course. Still others feel a quiet presence, a sense of being watched over or held, especially in moments of vulnerability. These experiences cannot be forced or manufactured, but they tend to arise naturally when a person is genuinely committed to the work of transformation, when they have made the inner decision to face themselves honestly and do whatever it takes to become whole. This commitment is itself a form of prayer, a declaration to the unconscious that you are ready, that you are willing to change, that you will cooperate with the process even when it is painful or frightening.